Welcome to episode 35 of the Addy Hour podcast. For those of you who've been listening and watching regularly, you know it's been a while since we released an episode. So I'm really excited to release this first episode of 2023. And I'm also excited to let you know that we'll be back to regularly scheduled episodes where you'll be seeing new Addy Hour episodes every other week for the months coming up. Now, in this first episode, I'm really excited to introduce and talk about a topic of burnout, which might sound like a strange place to start for the new year, but I think it's a topic that's really relevant to many of us in so many different spheres. But before we get there, I did want to make a quick announcement to all of you. I actually started a newsletter a couple of weeks back and wanted to make sure that you all know about that. If you want to check it out, you can find it on Substack. It's called the Addy Minute Newsletter. And if you're looking for it, just type into your browser, niiaddy.substack, that's substack.com, and you'll be able to find that newsletter. Definitely encourage you to check it out. In the newsletter, I'm going to be talking about aspects of my journey, also going to be sharing mental wellness tips with all of you, and also talking about some of the upcoming podcast episodes and engaging in further conversations around these episodes. It'll also be an opportunity for you all to engage with me and to also share ideas and comments and questions that you'd like me to ask our podcast guests. So definitely encourage you to check it out. And with that, just want to go ahead and let you all know about the two guests that are coming on. We're actually going to do something a little bit different because we weren't able to get both guests on the same episode at the same time. So we're actually going to release back-to-back episodes. I think you all are really going to enjoy it. We have guests from two different spheres and two different walks of life who are going to talk about this aspect of burnout and really trying to help us think about ways to thrive. So with that, I did want to go ahead and give a quick introduction to both guests. The first guest that will be joining for the episode today is Dr. Christine Pfund, who is a scientist with the Wisconsin Center for Education Research and the Department of Medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Pfund, as I mentioned, is a scientist. She earned her PhD in cellular and molecular biology. She followed that by postdoctoral research as plant pathology, but then shifted for almost a decade, was a co-director an associate director of the Delta Program in Research, Teaching, and Learning, and also co-director of the Wisconsin Program for Scientific Teaching. And there she really helped to train future faculty to become better and more effective teachers. Dr. Pfund has also led initiatives and directed national programs around mentoring, which is where many of those of you in academic spaces may have heard of her. She was one of the co-authors of the original Entering Mentoring curriculum, and she's also co-authored a lot of papers around mentorship. She directs the National Research Mentoring Network and also the newly established Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experience in Research. So again, someone who has been deeply invested in mentoring over the years and also co-authored an article about burnout in mentorship. So that's the topic of our conversation and something that I think will be very enriching for all of us. Again, we're going to release episodes back to back. So next week, we'll be bringing on a second guest who is also going to talk about this aspect of burnout, but talking about this from the perspective of a pastor. So thinking about service roles of pastors and those in different ministry opportunities and occupations and different faith traditions. But for that episode, we're going to have the privilege of welcoming Dr. David Ireland. Dr. Ireland is the founder and lead pastor of Christ Church, which is a 10,000-member multi-site congregation in North New Jersey that represents over 70 nationalities. So in that conversation, we obviously talk a lot about leadership as well. Dr. Ireland is a former diversity consultant for the NBA. He's also led chapel services for the New York Giants, the New York Jets, and at the U.S. Pentagon. He's the author of over 25 books, including Raising a Child Who Prays. And he is someone who speaks in a lot of different spheres and areas of impact, has traveled and spoken in over 75 nations, so someone who has tremendous impact. He holds graduate degrees in engineering, theology, organizational leadership, and social innovation, having also completed postdoctoral work at the University of Pennsylvania and at the University of Cambridge in England. So I know you all are going to definitely enjoy that conversation that's coming up 1 week from today. But with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into episode 35. Thanks again for being here. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Well, it's my pleasure to be able to lead off this conversation today. As you heard in the introduction, we're doing something a little bit different today since both of our guests weren't able to be at the recording at the same time, but we thought that both of their perspectives would be really important to share with you. So this is going to be a little bit of an experiment for us, but I think they'll still be able to riff off of one another, even though they're not actually physically in the same Zoom room at the same time. But it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Christine Pfund to the Addy Hour podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
So glad to be here. Really appreciate the invitation.
Of course. And I've heard your name for years. We finally got the chance to interact a couple months ago in an event. And so in a lot of ways, it's nice to be able to engage in this work together, just with all that you've done around mentorship and around this topic of burnout, as we'll talk about today. So definitely appreciate you being here and even taking the time to be here with us, not to make a bad joke, but I hope that as you get these requests like I have made today, this does not add to the likelihood susceptibility to burnout, but I guess we can get into that as well as we talk.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
So before we go there, my listeners know, and you know, that I like to just check in with people and see how they're doing at this point in time. So we're still in the early phases of 2023. So just wanted to ask how you're doing in the midst of that, with everything that you juggle and balance on a day-to-day basis, and just what your outlook is for the year ahead.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm doing really well. I'm still riding that high of the holidays, which were filled with lots of family and friends and games and laughter and food, probably a little bit too much food. And feeling like getting to ease into things. And it's been busy, but coming from a place of having a good rest, a lot of good energizing interactions. And even coming in today, after Martin Luther King holiday yesterday, which included, a little bit less stress schedule, a little time to sleep in, a little time to reflect, a little time to listen to some speakers and have some conversations with friends. So I'm joining you in a really grounded, centered place today. How about you? How are you doing today?
I'd say very similar. So I appreciate you asking that question. So in the same way, it's been nice just to have some time to slow down, to pause, especially with the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, as you mentioned too, which is always a mixture of the pausing and the reflection and just thinking about things where we've improved, things where we still have work to do. But again, just as I think very similar to you, it's the beginning of the year. Things haven't really picked up at the pace that they often do, although I think that's starting in the week ahead. So for me, I'm actually just trying to savor that. And full disclosure, also trying to have a mindset where I can actually slow down, even with all the pressures and tasks that have to be done, but just to actually slow down, to make room, to actually be present in the moment with all those, and to actually be more generative in the work that I do or in interactions that I have, whether that's, with colleagues or with students or with family members. So I'd say for me, I'm kind of, you can probably hear it in my voice, I'm still in that pseudo reflective place and just thinking about trying to put some good practices into place in the year ahead, so that when things actually do pick up, that I can still kind of have this mode of peace and reflection in the midst of the work as I'm going through it. So that may have been too much of an academic type of answer, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment. So
Yeah, I think I hear us both kind of just speaking into we're breathing. I'm headed actually made this trip yet last year at the end of January. I kind of flipped my time off, and actually on Friday headed back to Mexico to do some scuba diving.
Oh, wow.
And I only bring it up here because last year when I went, if you've scuba dived, you know that if you get to a neutral buoyancy, then you can control actually how your body moves simply by how deep you breathe in and how much you let the air out. You become buoyant. So just bringing that air into your lungs will raise you up, and blowing it out will make you sink a little. And I just mention it because when I came, I went back, I hadn't dove in a couple of years, and I came out of the water and I thought, oh, I had forgotten how to breathe.
Wow.
And I've been thinking about that all year. And when I get stressed, I just kind of imagine myself scuba diving and having that ability to breathe and control everything through your breath, which I know a lot of yogis also experience. And so I was just thinking yesterday, I'm going to re-tap into my need to think about breathing very concretely when I'm under the water next week.
That's great. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, with this things that we can apply from that as well. just going into the year, and again, just being in this place. So that's a great, yeah. I don't know if I'll be scuba diving anytime soon. That
I
sounds.
highly recommend. It was one of my dreams.
Mm,
I was terrified to learn. I was the worst student ever. Everything that could go wrong went wrong, and yet it's become something that I absolutely love to do. But it
wow.
it took a lot of learning. I had a lot of fears to overcome.
Mm. Wow. Well, that's great to hear. I mean, I'm trying not to parallel this to the podcast, but there's so many things in what you just said, even about resilience or about enduring something that's painful and challenging and what the reward is on the other side. So, okay, I won't go too far, but just to throw those out there, people
Go
know I
ahead,
can kind
peel
of
the
go off.
onion layers if you want.
People know I can go off on that for quite a bit in a good way. But again, I actually just appreciate you asking how I'm doing at this point in time too. So it's refreshing to be able to have that level of conversation. I think I think that candor has become more commonplace, and I'm hoping that
Mhm.
actually sticks in some of the circles that we move in. So definitely something that I appreciate. Other thing that I was going to do, just to pivot a little bit, because one of the things that you're known for, obviously, for those who are familiar with you and for those who aren't, to introduce is mentorship, and something that you spent a lot of time really investing in as a mentor and as a trainer of mentors, so to speak. So I was curious if you'd be able to share a little bit about how you got into that work, and then eventually we'll tie in how the mentorship and burnout piece came about as well.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so my college and post-college degrees are in biology.
Hmm.
So specifically, I have a PhD actually in cell and molecular biology, which means I had lots of opportunities to be mentored
Hmm.
in my quest to be a scientist. So I'll right out of the gate say I had lots of amazing mentors. Not everybody was perfect, and those ended up being incredible learning experiences along the way. I don't actually think any mentor can be perfect, but I think as a trainee, sometimes we expect that. I'm
Hmm.
not sure what perfection is in mentorship, but that's something we can unpack too. But along the way, especially in graduate school and my postgraduate work, I just kept finding myself more and more drawn to questions around how scientists were trained to do things outside, in my case, the research biology research laboratory, to do the other work they were called to do if they were to go on as faculty or in any kind of leadership. And these would include roles in teaching and in mentoring other folks. And the ability to teach and mentor has huge impacts on those with whom they work, but very few scientists are formally trained how to do either. And so that became very much a point of interest and fascination for me. And so over the last 18 years, I've had this amazing opportunity to investigate, in particular, mentorship. I also did a lot of work in teaching and learning, but
Hmm.
we'll focus on mentorship for today. And that led to helping develop programs to enhance mentorship. And that led to developing interventions or trainings to help folks become better mentors and better mentees. And then that research bug in my head really kept me talking to evaluators
Hmm.
and social scientists to understand how those types of trainings work. And then finding out that there were lots of research questions we could ask about what does it mean to be in an effective research mentoring relationship? What does it mean to have a good working alliance with someone? What are the impacts of mentorship and for who and in what context? And so that's been really the emergent work over almost 2 decades. And I'm not trained to do any of those things and have really learned on the job from amazing mentors, really kind of coming full circle. So I always like to say that I'm a scientist who started by studying microorganisms and I ended up studying people.
I think that's really well put. I appreciate the way you've captured all those pieces. Even the fact that you mentioned that you weren't trained, but that you did learn from mentors, but then you've also now been invested in the training itself and the science of mentorship, so to speak, and being able to bring those two together. And I think that's so important just to share, personal story. I remember when I first started my position, again, this is within an academic setting, but this obviously
Mhm.
applies in lots of other ways. But I do remember I was participating in a local conference and doing a session on mentorship. But some of the other more seasoned faculty basically were thinking, well, you're brand new. What can you have to share about mentorship? As if it was something that people just learned by osmosis. And just because you're more senior, that means you're a good mentor. If you're junior, then you must not be a good mentor. So
Right.
in some ways, in many ways, just appreciate the emphasis that you've put on that. And I think similar to you, even though I was junior at that point, had really strong mentors and was able to learn from them and apply those things so much so that people can weigh, oh, you actually did have something to say and to share with us, as if that was somehow not
How
possible.
surprising, right? Yeah, I always love when people are surprised. Yeah, and I really, think, early on in this work, when we asked mentors how they learned how to mentor, we basically got two answers. Either I learned from watching the mentors that I thought were effective and I like to try to do everything they modeled, or the opposite. Whereas I had horrible mentors and I'm trying to do everything exactly counter to what I experienced. And then it was basically trial and error. And even though every mentoring relationship is idiosyncratic, we have to understand people are individuals and have individual needs and come from different contexts and backgrounds, there are some core principles like communication that really folks can all, including ourselves, always optimize and always be able to enhance their toolbox.
Yeah, I highly agree. And even as you shared those two stories, I mean, one theme that jumps out to me from both of those is both of those were intentional. People were either intentionally trying to be like someone or intentionally trying to not be like someone else, but had that intentionality in how they moved forward. And again, just in my experience, and I'm sure in the work that you've done too, the fact that you have the training, the intentionality is there seems to be key. Because again, that question that was asked is almost as if the person assumed that I hadn't thought about mentorship because I was junior.
Right.
Of the
You
fact that I
hadn't
actually had been.
reflected on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. One of my dear friends and colleagues, and also an amazing scholar in this area, Dr. Angela Byers Winston, who's also here at UW-Madison. She always says, and we also try to echo in all of our mentorship education, is that it's not enough to be well-intentioned. You have to be intentional. And I think to add to that, and be intentional with tools and evidence in your back pocket. You don't come from a place of not being informed. And that doesn't mean you have to necessarily have read 50 books on mentorship, but take a moment to reflect on why you're doing things. Ask the people you're working with if it's working for them. Those are parts of being intentional too. It's not just, I decided I'm going to lose weight this year and I'm going to focus on it. It's like, well, why hasn't that worked before? And who's going to help me? Like, there's a lot of components to being intentional.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. Such wisdom in that, such wisdom that we can definitely apply going forward. So, and again, I mean, you're demonstrating what you've already said at the beginning of just how you've taken and learned things from so many different people, from your colleagues, and just incorporated that in the work that you're doing. So, I appreciate that you're practicing what you preach in a lot of ways. So, the other thing I know that people are eager about this episode is this topic of burnout as well. And I guess I'm segueing by saying practicing what you preach, because for our listeners, we'll also have another guest who will be joining, who is actually a pastor and a leader who also has talked about these aspects of burnout, but then also mentorship and coaching in different roles, and those who are in pastoral roles and in ministry. So again, we've talked about this intentionality and moving things forward, but there can also be extremes of that, and not even extremes, and especially in service roles when you're so invested in other people, that can easily lead to a place of burnout. So Chris, I was wondering if you could just share how the burnout topic even came up within this realm of mentorship, and what brought that about? Because I imagine it's something that's not just imagine, I know it's always been there, but not always talked about.
Yeah, it's actually so we wrote a piece, my colleagues and I, and I'll mention who I'm talking about in a minute, for the Harvard Business Review in last year. And it's a funny story, actually, how it came to be. So maybe I'll share a little bit with the listeners, because I also think it's about how things just happen, but you have to be looking for them. So there are four of us worked on this piece for Harvard Business Review. So Ruth Godian and Cheveso Cook and Brad Johnson. And so Ruth is a chief learning officer and assistant professor at Wiley Cornell Medicine in New York. And then Cheveso goes by Chevy Cook. He's actually a U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, and he's at Fort Meade, but he also runs this nonprofit called Military Mentors.
Oh, wow.
And then Brad Johnson, he's actually a professor of psychology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the U.S. Naval Academy, and he also has a position at Johns Hopkins. These three folks have been kind of what I'll call in the science and practice of mentorship world for quite a while. And they've written different types of things, and they study different types of things. And as you can imagine, just from hearing where they work.
Yeah.
And we've all known about each other's work, and we've all been fans of each other's work, but we haven't been in the same spaces necessarily. And over the last about 4 or 5 years, we'd end up finding ourselves in the same room, but not all together. So 2 of us would be at one thing, and then 2 of us would be at something else. And every time that would happen, the group that was physically together on Zoom or physically together in person or on Zoom would say, oh, we have to write something together. And each of the different folks had written with each other. So this happened again in early spring 2022. Is Chevy and I were at a meeting. We said, we have to write something together. And I said, oh, well, Ruth has been saying we have to write something else together. And then Brad was at this meeting too. And he's like, well, I don't have a lot of time, but we should write something together. So we finally all got on a Zoom call. No idea what we were going to write about. Literally just said, we all admire each other. We're all thinking in this space. We should surely, if we got on a call together, we could come up with something we should write together. And so I like to share that part because I think that from the outside, it sometimes looks like everything is structured and we came to a conversation and you better show up with a brilliant idea. Otherwise, why would you show up? No, we literally got on a call and said, all we want to do is do something together. We don't know what we should do. And so we started talking and everybody said, oh, yeah, it would be great to write something together, but I'm too busy. I'm kind of burnt out. I'm kind of tired. You can see where this is going. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I've been talking to mentors and they've been talking about being burnt out and I'm kind of feeling burnt out. And then Brad Johnson said, I've actually written a topic about mentor self-care in 2018 and about how to avoid burnout. And so really like within an hour, we had said, that's it. We've got to write something about avoiding mentor burnout. And we literally just set up a Google Doc and we started throwing things in it. And then we met like 2 more times and we did the whole thing in a couple, like several weeks.
Wow.
And then fortuitously, it turned out that Brad had a connection at Harvard Business Review. They were looking for an article. So, it just kind of happens that way. In the networking, but it really was interesting because when we finished and we wrote it, and we can talk more about what's in the article if you want, we all said that we felt really re-energized after writing it, even though we had put something new on our plate. And you and I were joking before we kind of started the podcast is like, oh, I hope I didn't like make you feel burnt out because I asked you to do the podcast or for you thinking you're doing one more podcast. But we realized that, there is something in just thinking about burnout, in thinking through why am I feeling that way? What things energize me? What's drawing my energy away? And this article energized us. That actually helped us feel less burnt out than when we decided to do it. So that's just a little bit of kind of how it actually all played out. And it was a wonderful thing to do with 3 amazing colleagues that we had all wanted to do something together. And then we all felt better.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, I appreciate hearing how you all were attentive to what you were experiencing in that moment too. I mean, just the fact of naming it seems like it was so cathartic isn't the right word, but just
yeah. Well, and then someone would say, oh, this week I don't have any time, and someone else would say, well, I'll spend 30 minutes on it this week, and then I'll hand it off. And so it became kind of the process of like all the things we were saying in the article of then saying, wait, am I doing that?
Yeah.
Which is always, a little bit scary. I thought about, when you asked me to be a guest is that the thing I was most nervous about was not how many ums and not would I say something that didn't sound smart, or it was mostly if my friends or colleagues or family listened to it, would they tell me that I had been authentic to how they were experiencing me dealing burnout?
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess that level, in a sense, of accountability as well.
Yeah, right. Was I going to get on and be like, well, here's how you avoid it? And then they'd be like, literally 3 weeks ago, you were so burnt out, just to be honest. And I think that taking time to just be honest about what it means when we feel burnt out has been really important. I was thinking a lot about, since writing the article and thinking about it, I've done a lot better job of querying burnout. What does that mean? When I say I'm burnt out, or I hear someone say they're burnt out, first I want to validate that in myself and others, but also to say, what does that actually mean? Does it mean I'm exhausted to the point that I need to go sleep for 3 days? Does it mean I'm actually just irritated by everybody asking me for something, and actually if I take a walk, I'm going to be okay? Or am I really at a place of such burnout that I'm being cynical, I'm being inefficient in everything I do because my mind's wandering because I can't focus? But that's been really helpful in listening for in myself and others, is when we say that, just investigating it a little bit.
That's really good. How have you helped people to do that? I'm curious, and even in a way, because I know you centered the article kind of in the history of the term. So I'm curious how you have suggested that people apply that, to their own situations, and then also based on how they apply that, how do they actually move forward to kind of move out of that place of those different, not tiers, but different modes of burnout.
Yeah. And I'm certainly, not an expert in helping people, definitely not a therapist, although my mother is one, but I do think that, well, I could even say to you, so, the last time you felt really burnt out is think about what you were feeling. Think about the weight of it. How big did it feel? Did it feel all consuming? Was it only in certain contexts? Was it every day? Was it only when you were dealing with certain issues? To try to just examine it a little bit. So I think that it's not one specific way, but to allow someone to explore, tell me what that feels like. Tell me when that happens. Tell me about what you do when you feel like that, so that then we can kind of say, oh, wow. So it's sounding like whenever you think about, let's just use, for example, the enormous weight of parental care that you're engaged in, that's where it's really feeling enormous. And that it's trickling into all of your work, but that is at its core is where your burnout's coming from. And so, what could you do around that?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I mean, even just doing a mental exercise as you were asking that and thinking about getting back to even mentoring, all the different types of mentoring roles that I have. And if I had to say, oh, well, I could notice some specific patterns in certain types of roles where there was more of a burnout feel or feeling too spread thin, and thinking about, well, then I might not feel like I have as much time to respond to those things or feeling more irritable about those things. So even in that exercise, I think that's really helpful to kind of piece through it and think about in that very pragmatic way. Now, I'm also curious, as you wrote that, how did people respond to the article? Because I could see it going in different ways. I could see it being refreshing for people. I could see sometimes people being reactive to it. Maybe needing to hear it, but not wanting to. And not to put words in your mouth, but those are just things that kind of come to mind as I think about how people might have reacted. But I'm curious what your experience was and how people responded.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a little bit of everything. So I think for some, it provided validation for how they were feeling. That they could say, yeah, I know this mentoring work is important, but it's exhausting sometimes. And just to be able to say it. It doesn't mean you're not committed to mentoring. It doesn't mean you don't want a good job, but just it's okay to say that it takes energy and you're tired. I think it encouraged some mentors to take a minute to look for signs of burnout in themselves and others and be honest about where they are, but then the answer could be difficult. And I think when the answer is, I am burnt out, and feel like I need to take a break from mentoring, and I feel like I'm in a position that I can't because of who the consequences, whether that be political, whether that be for promotion and tenure in the academic setting, whether that be consequential to the people you're mentoring. But one of the things we tried to raise in the article was kind of, we didn't call it this, but it was kind of like, if you're faking it. So if you're trying to mentor from a place of exhaustion and burnout, you're probably not doing a good job. And this was actually couched in a term by one of the wonderful mentorship scholars, Bell Rose Raggins, who actually called it marginal mentoring, where you're basically engaged in dysfunctional or disengaged mentoring because you're so depleted.
Wow.
So you might think, fine, I'll meet with all 7 of my mentees, but if you're really doing that from a place of exhaustion, there's consequences to that in terms of the kind of mentorship you are. And I think that was the other thing that that we really got some interesting feedback on was the permission and suggestion to talk about burnout with your mentees, to normalize that conversation, that there are imperfections, if you even want to call it, there's normalcy, there's coping, there's avoiding, and that when mentors continue to try to model that they never get burnt out and they're never tired, the mentees begin to believe they cannot do that job. Wow. Because they'll say, I'll never be able to do that without saying I'm tired sometimes. So I think that was one piece we wanted to give people, and the encouragement to be realistic and honest about there's ups and downs, there's burnout, there's exhaustion, and model how to do it. Model as a mentor of saying, I can't meet with you this week. It's not because I don't care. It's because I actually probably won't be helpful because I'm just burnt out. And that being okay. I mean, obviously there's context. People can be in crisis. We're not saying like someone's in crisis and saying I can't help you, at least to refer them to someone else. But in the day-to-day, and I think back to that there's risk of just pushing through as a mentor. So I think, those were some of the things in terms of feedback. And I think you're right. I mean, for some folks, we don't want to think about it, or mentors say, well, yeah, that's nice, but I'm trapped. I'm not a big, I remember all the way back to high school, is one of my most influential teachers. One of the exercises they would do is that whenever you were feeling trapped, they said you had to come up with at least 3 approaches to the situation you were in. You could not only come up with 2. And I always think back to that, because I think when we feel trapped, the exercise of saying, how could I get out? Or how could I change it, is to try to think beyond 1 or 2 options. Now, that's also contextual. So, I know one of the things, and we can talk about in a little bit, is not everybody gets asked the same amount of service work or mentorship. Not everybody has the ability to have folks help. Some folks have a lot of additional family help. They have access to money that they can throw at the problem. Folks will be like, oh, you're burnt out, just go on a spa vacation. Well, that's not accessible to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. And that's lovely if you can do that, but that's probably not an answer that's going to really resonate with a lot of people who feel like that's completely inconsiderate of our inequity and access to those kind of things. Taking a walk, it's a little bit different. Believing you don't have 5 minutes to walk because you feel so crunched, and saying to somebody, I really want to encourage you to just take a moment and hear what you're saying, that you don't have 5 minutes. Like, that makes me sad that you feel that way. So let's talk about why you feel that way. But yeah, so I think an article like this triggers all of those things.
Well, I mean, there's so many layers there, and just the way that you've brought all those to light, even as you were talking about the modeling, as we talked about from the beginning, mentoring well from learning from either good models or poor models, and just the way that acknowledging that burnout can be such an example, I think, is huge. But then even all the other pieces that you mentioned as well, and a lot to unpack there, but just the guilt that comes with that sometimes, the perfectionism that come with that sometimes, but then even the inequities, as you mentioned, and all the complexity that comes with that. A topic that I'm sure that I know you all touched on as well is the mentor as well, and whether it's a female mentor, whether it's someone from an underrepresented group, and the additional burden that comes just in conversations that I've had with so many people in personal experience of knowing that some of our mentees feel like they can't go to anybody else, which then adds another layer of guilt in the sense that we can think, if we don't mentor this person, who will? And there is truth to that to some extent too, but then how much that can also lead towards that burnout. So I appreciate the way that you brought that up in the article. And I'm just curious, if there's anything you'd want to expand on that tension, that real tension that's there as well, because obviously you can also get to a point, as you mentioned, of mentoring so many that you become ineffective. So where, I know there is no perfect answer, but how have you, how did you all at least describe that? And how have you been thinking about some of those?
Yeah, and I don't know that, when you're writing a short article for, for a publication like a Harvard Business Review, you're going to get crunched. And so you can't really unpack all of that. You can leave little breadcrumb trails for that. But I think that's one of the great things is you get a lot of people kind of thinking about it and a lot of publicity around it, but you don't get to really dig into nuance. And that can rub people the wrong way. Absolutely. It's like, because you get this sense like it's not that simple. And then, part of it is, hoping that the authors know it's not that simple and we're limited by space. But also there's sometimes when, authors miss things. I'm sure we missed things too, where folks thought, did you not consider? And there are probably many thoughts people had about things that we didn't consider and is room to grow. I do think you raise, especially around, we know, and I'm sure many of, the guests you've had before know that individuals from underrepresented groups, they get asked to do more of this work. Let's just more of the mentorship work, when we're talking about academic settings, we know they're asked to do more mentorship work, more equity, inclusion, diversity, justice work, more psychosocial work. So there's a huge inequity about what they're asked to do. And it's not just what they're asked to do by leadership. It's what they're sometimes articulated and not articulated, expected to do by their peers. And then what they are asked to do by folks who feel like they share certain identities with them. And even though I think there is a real call to white identified folks like myself to take some of that burden on and to do the work that's needed to be more culturally responsive and to be a more culturally responsive mentor, and we do a lot of that type of training, is at the end of the day is there's a lot of mentees that are wary, that don't trust, have every right not to trust that someone like me could hear them and support them, no matter how much I've prepped. And at a minimum, even if they believe it, don't want to start there. And so that puts additional burden on folks like yourself. And so, I know there's a lot of talk and effort to make that work valued and to compensate it. But again, no amount of compensation buys you time. It doesn't buy you a refill on the emotional drain. And so I think it should still be done. I'm a big fan of being compensated for that work. And it can't be the only answer because it can't solve all of the burnout that is unequally divided amongst people.
It's really well said. And even as you were talking about it, it really resonate with the not being able to buy time. But in a way, it also made me think about the experience that you all had as authors as well. Even just naming that burnout and just the power that can also come from having conversations like this, or for those of us who are from overlapping backgrounds, having the space to talk about that together. And this is just anecdotal. This is not evidence-based, but just as I've been reflecting on some of the things that you said, and so many other guests have shared about the work that they do, just being in the room. So many people have come on this podcast and even made that type of comment about the conversations they've had here. not that it removes the challenges or the burnout that may come, but just to be able to kind of walk through that and think collectively about ways to navigate that, I think can be really powerful as well.
Well, and it could be compounded. We know that one of the things that I think we talked about when we were working on the article was, data like women physicians spend on average 2 minutes more on each patient than men, and are more likely to explore the socio-emotional and psychosocial issues during the visit. And, I know Brad Johnson had referred to that in some of his earlier work. So it feels like just 2 minutes, but 2 minutes and the type of emotional work over time, across a day, across a week, across a year, it takes a toll, and it's not equal. I think the other thing about burnout too is, I have a lot of, feel very honored that I have a lot of friends and colleagues who, will challenge me, call me out. And I remember one colleague saying, this was way before we worked on the article, but I remember saying something like, "Oh, I'm just feeling so burnt out on all this work." And she knew I acknowledged there was inequity and who held work and all of that. But it was this kind of off the cuff comment, but it has sat with me, and I think there's so much power in it. And she's a Black identified individual, and she said, "I've felt burnt out. You feel burnout right now. I feel burnout every week of every day for my entire career." And I just had to stop and even think about folks talking about burnout, wanting to honor their burnout, but also calling people to contextualize their burnout. Even burnout has privilege in that we've had episodic burnout as opposed to consistent burnout. And I think those are just things, again, I want to honor the individual experience and not devalue anyone saying they feel burnout. That's not my intent. But I think it's important for us to realize that even in our speaking into this space, we are not all talking about the same level of burnout, the same causes of burnout, or the frequency at which we're feeling it.
Yeah, I think that's really well said as well. And just again,
I have no idea what it would feel like to feel burnt out my entire career, every single month of my career. That is an absolute foreign concept to me, because I've had the privilege not to feel it.
Yeah. But even in hearing that challenging story, part of me feels encouraged that you all had the space to have that conversation. And then, as you've mentioned, even with the article itself too, like there's just such a need to be able to unpack that. I think like in that context, if even if it's, let's say there were 2 other individuals who are having that same conversation, to be able to then delve in and really understand what that means. So much learning that can happen from that. And the learning obviously isn't enough in and of itself. But again, it just seems like it creates this opportunity in a sense, and maybe not being too optimistic, but just to have community in that sense, to be able to share those 2 different experiences. Even you saying, I can't imagine what that would feel like, to have someone voice that to you and then to have a dialogue. I think there's a lot of power that comes from that as well.
Yeah, it can be such a scary space, and it's where the most amazing learning is happening. Which is, why I'm so appreciative you're doing the podcast series, because it creates space for that. I was saying, before we started, I was really so loving the experiment in you being accommodating of the schedules of myself and Dr. Ireland, and I would have loved to have been on the same space, but the fact you had put us together got me really thinking about my faith, my Christian upbringing, what's the narrative in my head and heart about service and being a servant and being selfless and burnout. And so I'm really excited to hear the whole podcast roll together, to hear thoughts on that. But I've really spent a couple weeks, not consistently, but since your invitation, wrestling around, the messaging and my belief that we are called, in my Christian faith and in other faiths, but I can only speak from my my lived faith, to embrace service to the point of selflessness.
Mm-hmm.
And that the narrative that's written is that will fulfill you,
Mm-hmm.
that you will gain energy from that. But then I know that if you give to the point of collapse, it serves no one.
Mm-hmm.
And so just sitting in that paradox, for lack of a better word, I don't have an answer, but I've realized I haven't reconciled those. And you brought up the word guilt, and, I've been of late, been working with a really wonderful leadership coach in the last year. And you're probably not surprised, I totally subscribe to servant leadership. But as our work has grown, I have realized that can't be my only approach, because it's actually impossible, because I can't be in service to everyone and just keep it growing. There becomes a limit.
Yeah.
And so I'm having to change my leadership style, and I feel a little guilty about it. So yeah, you're saying yes, like you've been, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. But I hadn't considered how wrapped up that struggle was in my faith. And this has really afforded me the opportunity and to really think about that, because of the pairing you put together for the podcast. I don't think I would have gone there in my thinking.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, you had a very interesting look on your face. So I'm really curious what you're thinking right now.
Yeah, you definitely picked up on it. And partially, before we wrap up, I'm going to also ask you if you have any particular question you'd like me to pose to Dr. Ireland, as you've been thinking through this as well. But I can definitely relate in a lot of ways. Even going back to when you were asking early on for me to think about times when I felt burnt out, or even when you were doing the check-in early on. So that's part of the conversation that's come up in my leadership coaching as well, specifically around mentorship. So thinking about how that has shifted over the years as I've gotten more and more involved in different groups and different initiatives. Full disclosure, whenever I tell people what I do, not even on a daily basis, but just in general, people always ask me if I sleep. That's always the next question that comes up, which is an important question. But it also means that I can't be involved in mentoring the same way I was 13 years ago when I started the lab, or scale to do things that I've done now. And I even share this as I'm mentoring others in leadership positions too. Sometimes I have to make difficult decisions about, do I take this one-on-one mentoring opportunity here, or do I take an opportunity to go speak to a group of 50 people at once and share? And that is not a numbers thing per se, but there's also an effectiveness. And I don't want to call it efficiency, but it doesn't feel like the right tone for mentorship, but also like how much can I get this information out to people who need it? So even in the leadership coaching that I've been having those feelings of guilt and being coached and told that those are going to come, and I basically just have to ride them out, because I can either try to address the guilt and continue doing things the way I was before and move towards a deeper phase of being burnt out, or I can be wise about it, try to spread things out, try to nominate and have others step into those roles to limit some of my mentorship, which feels bad, and there's guilt that comes with that, because sometimes there are really important needs. So I think I'm right there, and you could sense that as you were sharing that I'm right there in the middle of that and trying to think about that. Even going all the way back to the first question you asked about the check-in, because even right now I'm starting to write a book proposal and doing those types of things. I have to be very disciplined in setting aside time to do that, or it's never going to happen, which means I have to say no to some mentorship opportunities, some other opportunities. So just in the middle of all those pieces simultaneously. So a lot that I can relate to, which you very well picked up on in my in my nods. But it's an ongoing process, and as you've talked about too, it's a learning process. So I'm still learning as I go through, and just trying to be open with people about those yeses and nos, even though they're not easy.
Yeah, it is a journey. Yeah, and I would love to hear, for Dr. Ireland, is what advice or what experiences have they had in coping with the emotional part of saying no's to people who are in need? even if you know that that no is completely justified, is the right thing in terms of priorities and impact and self-care, is there's a cost with saying no, and maybe there isn't to everyone. I don't know, actually. I don't know if I feel that because of my upbringing, because of my faith, because I haven't queried it until now. And so I'd be really curious, because clearly they have to say no to people in need to be able to succeed and survive in those heavy compassionate care jobs. And yet, how do you deal with that? Because as you said, so you decide to give the talk to 50, and it might turn out that 3 people of those 50, it is incredibly impactful and meaningful, and it's the right choice. And then the one-on-one mentee you said no to might feel, not that it's irreversible, but might temporarily feel abandoned, or that they're not a priority. And in that decision, they were not a priority. And that doesn't mean it isn't justified, but that's such a struggle in terms of how to feel about that.
Yeah. I 100% agree. And I'm
so
still
just
in the
love
midst of
because
it.
to think through it. I'd also love to hear just about the encouragement that I suspect is that we're not doing it alone. And even many of our faith leaders now and in the past, whatever your belief, there are stories across all religions about people in those roles, whether it's Jesus or, whomever, being fed, being cared for, resting, being washed, being supported, literally in the case of Christian faith, carrying the cross for, to take the burden off for a while. And I've been thinking a lot about that in the sense of how often when we get burnt out, we narrow our circle and we go internal. And when we need support the most, whether it's just some perspective or it's just somebody to take a little bit of the burden off, but we tend to isolate when we feel burnt out.
Wow, that's really well said. You did say you're not a psychologist, but you did say you have a mother who's a therapist. So
My mother is a family
sensing
therapist.
Some of those,
Yes, definitely. And, and in full disclosure, we've had a lot of, mental health challenges across the whole family. And so, and have had what I feel is a privilege to talk about it, it's hard to cope when you literally cannot do something because your body or your mind tell you cannot, and needing to accept help. And so anyway, not my area of expertise, but putting these 2 topics together made me think a lot about, I'm really curious in the pastoral care realm, how these kinds of questions are thought about and reflected on. I'm sure there will be no answers, just like there's no answers for how we make every decision around our role as mentors. But to your point earlier, but that we're being reflective and intentional in those decisions, because at least you have an answer for why. I know somebody might challenge your why, but at least you have a why.
And the other thing that, as you're sharing is really jumping out to me is just, again, the importance of community. And my listeners have heard me say that a lot, but even as you were talking about just how easy it is to become very narrow in focus, and the importance of community to bring those outside perspectives sometimes, or to help us to pause and see things from a different perspective. Even as you talked about, if someone is in a place of burnout, having someone in community to help them kind of think about where that's happening. I mean, the way that you were doing that, even as we were talking, and how important that could be as well. And my anticipation would be, even in talking with Dr. Island, the importance of that community for him as a leader of leaders, and helping other leaders to remember to have those bigger perspectives. Because I know he's also done boot camps for pastoral staff and helping them think through some of those pieces about I would imagine even though they're focused on others, it can be easy to be isolated and driven in that focus to not have enough perspective from outside. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'll be curious. Maybe I'll try have him respond to some of these questions as well. Unfortunately, he won't be able to ask you questions that you could then respond to, but perhaps we'll create some type of other way for that to happen as well. But I think that's going to be really,
it would only be
really
fair,
telling.
right? So
And
you brought up something
yeah.
that is really interesting that I've been thinking about a lot too, is, so you said, do people ask you, do you sleep?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a question of things we don't talk about either, and
Mm-hmm.
actually is probably one of the most important things in terms of self-care. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll answer if you answer. Do you sleep? How much do you sleep?
I do sleep. So it depends. So I think I've become, maybe this is my age catching up to me, more adamant about that as I've
Mm.
gotten older. So whereas before, I would even, in the last 2 years when I started this podcast, I would tend to let that stuff kind of go into the night. Whereas now I'm trying to be more particular about just having a shut off time. And again, this may be the age, but I'm just also in the spirit of what we've been talking about, just paying attention. When we talked about paying attention to things like burnout, paying attention to how much less effective I am as the day goes on. And then just realizing if I just leave that, I'm going to feel behind, but I'm going to do it 5 times faster if I come back to it the next day more refreshed. So part of my, I think, getting sleep is also, again, this goes back to the guilt. I don't like leaving things feeling undone, but allowing myself to say that's fine. And that will actually help me still get the rest I need and will actually help me be more efficient and maybe more refreshed and think through things more carefully when I come back to it. So I'd say that's kind of my experience. Not perfect yet. There are, family responsibilities and activities and all those things that throw sleep out the window often. Not completely, but you could always have more. But I'd say from that standpoint, better than I would have expected. I think if I didn't get that, I'd actually probably be in a place of being burnt out and have to take away one of the many components that I'm involved in at the moment.
Yeah, I hear you on that. My husband says sleeping is my superpower. So I do sleep. I can sleep anywhere. And when I'm up, I'm up. And when I'm done, I'm done.
That's good.
And I've had to grapple with, I am a less, I would have used the word crabby when I don't sleep or if I don't tend to my sleep, but it is more than that. I'm not as kind as I want to be when I don't sleep. And somehow being honest with myself about that made me be able to prioritize it even more. Because there's something about, if I say to myself, not just, so I love it, like what you're saying is like letting it go till the next day because I'll do it more efficiently and more effectively. I'm on your train on that one. And saying, if you choose to stay up, you're probably going to have meetings in which you're not as kind as you would strive to be. And then have to own that. And so anyway, I'm still working on that too, but that narrative to me has been very interesting in terms of motivation.
That's really helpful. Yeah. And again, just the level of honesty that you're willing to have with yourself as well.
But then it makes me even more, my children are both grown now, but oh man, when they're little and you don't have any power over the sleep you're getting and just trying to make it, and or if you have other family responsibilities, is so much empathy for that stage of life. It is challenging.
Yeah. And I had forgotten that until I had been around family members with young kids again, and it took me back. Then I didn't know how I'd forgotten that. Yeah. Well, again, just really appreciate, just your honesty with so many different aspects. I'm going to venture a guess to say that this is not a typical conversation that you have on a daily basis in your work in terms of the things that we've spanned. But I really appreciate your willingness to be able to kind of think through and wrestle with those two. And even as you brought up the faith aspect, and that's something that's definitely near and dear to me and to what we try to do on this podcast, just to have deep, honest conversations about all aspects of our lives and not get stuck in this kind of compartmentalizing and pretending that there are aspects of our lives that exist, whether we come from a faith perspective or not. So really appreciate your willingness, and we'll definitely pass some of those questions along as well. One last question I did want to ask you, though, comes from our listeners, and particularly because people were so excited about this topic of burnout. So one of our listeners asked how to avoid or at least deal with burnout, and this is specifically within academic context, but it expands elsewhere as well. But just as people kind of get more and more roles and responsibilities with career development and achievement and things like that, and I won't call it the problem, but the challenge of people who seem to be doing things well and then seem to get more and more added onto their plate, and just knowing how to navigate that. I don't know if you have any specific words of wisdom you want to share there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'm going to come back to kind of what I started to share in the journey of even writing the piece. And then what I've noticed in my own practice is, and it might sound simple, but is really, and I'll use the word in, querying burnout. So, I was listening to, and I'm going to embarrass to say I don't remember what podcast it was. So, but don't worry, I will never forget that it's this podcast. But I realized the irony in me saying that is like, I listened to something and I didn't remember whose it was. So sorry to that person, but it was really interesting. It was about someone who had a very, very high pressure job, very, leadership position, and just felt so burnt out that they just left. That's it. And then in this person's story, they went on, I think they went and lived on an island, actually. Oh, wow. If I'm remembering it right. And poor person, if they've ever listened to this, is going to think I'm completely slaughtering their story. So I apologize. But the basic idea was completely burnt out, decided the only answer was to completely remove themselves. Went and basically did nothing, and had the opportunity to do that. Most of us can't do that, but then missed everything about their work. And I only raise it because some of the reflections then that came back, they did then end up going back to work, and was that it wasn't all the things on their list. It was perspective. They actually loved most of the work they did. It actually energized them a lot of the time. They liked their colleagues and working with them. They were passionate about doing something meaningful. But it had all gotten a bit much. They couldn't prioritize. They couldn't focus. It was all just too much. And the inability to have perspective on it just seemed like the only thing you could do was to just leave. And I think we've all been there. When we look at everything we feel we're being asked to do, or we even feel compelled to do, and we go, it's impossible. And I think that the querying of it in the burnout is saying, okay, it is probably impossible. So I could go the extreme and do none of it. That has consequences. Or I can think about which pieces I'm going to do or not. And then, obviously, like you said, in community, start to query that. And what is draining? What is sustaining? How are those balanced? And so I really do think, especially, if we're talking about junior colleagues in academia who see this, place that they have to get to in order to be promoted, and it feels so high impact and so high stakes. And then all of the other things are being asked to do and compelled to do, and starting to query about what sustains, what burns out, what's going to pay out, what's not, and to not do that alone. I think, when we do that alone, everything about our own biases, all our habits, they all play out. And sometimes, it's interesting, we both talk about coaches. Someone reflecting back, and you've probably had this experience back, if they reflect it back and you go, oh, right. So actually what you've heard me saying is there's really one major priority that I want to get done this month, and I should spend time on that. And then suddenly it's clear, but I couldn't see it myself. So that may be, to your listeners, feel like way too straightforward, but I feel like examining ourselves is sometimes the best thing to do. And if you feel like it is impossible without burning out, it probably is.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you can't get help to make some choices.
Yeah.
But it's back to that trapped feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And the drowning feeling that becomes terrifying. And to go back to, having somebody walk you through and say, if you're feeling trapped and burnt out, let's come up with 7 possible ways that could maybe be a little different. And maybe one of those will be worth trying, not just one way. You quit and go to an island, was kind of like, that is an option, maybe. For a lot of people, not an option. But I think it's so much about perspective. And I think, I'll be curious what Dr. Ireland says. And I think that, if you, have belief in a certain faith, or even if you don't believe in a certain religion, but, whatever your beliefs are about what is valued, what's important, what those communities can do for you is to give perspective.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, that's often what we're most afraid of, but we're most seeking. Is just a different perspective, because we're trapped in our own head and heart.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I think that's a really helpful answer, even if it feels straightforward. And I think, as people listen to this, they will have that experience of what you just mentioned too, just hearing it, even though you're not speaking with them in direct conversation, just having that reflective moment, I think will be really important. Because it is
so my husband does for me. I always say he's my best partner because, and I know we're ending up, so I'll tell a little funny anecdote, but so I'll come home sometimes and, like many, I'll complain about everything that everybody's asked me to do and how things are unfair and I'm being blocked everywhere. Everything I try to do is blocked by someone or the system. And, we've all been there. The world's against us.
Yep.
And I'll say, I can't, I don't know if I can do all this work in this job. And he'll listen and he'll say, that sounds hard. And then he'll say, let me remind you, every day you get to go to a job that you feel like is making a difference in the world, that people listen to you and sometimes think you have good ideas, that you have some power. It's not as much as you want, but you have privilege. And he'll just run the list and he'll say, and of course, in doing it, he's not trying to not validate it. He's trying to just give some perspective. And I go, and I always say, yes, I'm still frustrated, but yeah, I forgot about that. And so for me, and that doesn't work for everyone, and I know that can be triggering, and obviously not everyone feels like someone's going to be able to say, and here's all your privilege, because not everybody goes to a job where they feel heard and that the work they do is meaningful and valued. But for most faculty, to get to where they are, you have been hired because people believe you have something to contribute. You have taken that job because you feel like you have something to give that's going to change the world, that's going to have impact. And that alone is an amazing opportunity. Yeah, the system stinks and lots has to change and it's not fair and it's not equitable. But for the folks in the academy, there are certain beautiful things about the opportunities to work in a space like that. It needs a lot of work, but it does offer a pretty amazing opportunity to do that work.
Yeah, highly agree. And again, just the importance of community to be able to remind each other of that, the way your husband has done, and to be able to celebrate those things as they happen. I mean, so many ways I've seen communities rise
Look
up
at
to
your
celebrate.
job. You get to do a podcast. I mean, it's amazing that this gets to be part of your work and your mission is just an amazing thing.
Yeah. I do feel honored, blessed, and privileged in that sense as well. And it's such a reminder to me. I mean, everything you just shared, as guests have come on and shared that with me, as listeners have continued to share that, even people who found this podcast through different means. I mean, even meeting with someone this week who said, oh, I just saw this pop up into my YouTube feed, and was able to share just the ways that the podcast has really encouraged them. So again, as you mentioned, that privilege and that perspective is huge. In some ways, I feel like I've been using this podcast to facilitate more of these conversations, because I come away so encouraged from these types of things as well. And for me, I would even say, this past, I can't even track anymore. It's been 2 years, almost 2 years of the podcast has been so helpful for that perspective as well. And just that frequent reminder. And then again, seeing people who are invested in so many different areas and walks of life, I think is really, just really touching. I don't even know if I can put words into it per se, as you're actually helping me reflect. And I think, just projecting it forward, projecting it onto listeners who are tuning in, even for those, for many of us who have felt feelings of burnout or getting too close, trying to pull back. I think the perspective is huge. And again, it goes back to what we talked about, I think, at the beginning of this recording, and just the place that we both seem to be at this moment, being able to be excited and reflective, and being able to hold on to that even when the busyness comes. So I appreciate you sharing that story from your husband. That's part I'm going to go back and listen to again. Just the way that I like how he said that people sometimes listen to you, because I think that's part of it as well. That's
right,
that mixture,
but also,
yep. But even that sometimes is still important. And,
it's still, it's such a, and I think on this topic of, I know it's burnout, but mentorship it's hard as the work can be, as tiring it can be, and we don't want mentors to be burnout. Mentorship is just the most amazing, privileged work. To be able to influence someone's life one-on-one like that, it's amazing.
Well said. And a great parallel to Dr. Ireland coming up as
yes,
well.
Can't wait to hear his thoughts. So wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for taking time to share so honestly and openly here, and practically as well. I know that people are really going to enjoy listening to this, and I hope this will also generate some conversation in communities, as we've talked about already today. So Dr. Pfund, thank you again. I've really enjoyed hosting you.
Thanks for the opportunity.